What's up, YouTube? This is True Raw for TV. Alright, so in this particular video, I want to talk about part 2 of the 3-part documentary series on Wilt Chamberlain that's now airing on Showtime called Goliath. Yesterday I did a review of the first episode. Now this episode focused pretty much on the years between 1962 and 1968 for Wilt Chamberlain. They talked about that narrative that was growing at that time, that Wilt was this Goliath who may have been the biggest, the strongest player in the NBA, the most dominant player, but yet he kept losing to David, aka Bill Russell. And I think that the documentary does a pretty decent job of explaining how, yes, Bill Russell was only 6'10 and 225, 230. Wilt grew to be 7 feet 1, roughly around 300 pounds, give or take a buffet meal or two. But Bill Russell had the advantage of playing on a much more talented team. Bill Russell played with 12 other Hall of Famers in his NBA career. He played on one team, Boston. At times, Bill Russell had 8 Hall of Famers, other Hall of Famers on his roster. So that doesn't get talked about, the fact that he played with John Havlicek and Sam Jones and K.C. Jones and Bob Cousy and Bill Sharman, Tom Heinsohn, Havlicek, if I haven't said him yet. That's not talked about as much, but it doesn't fit the narrative because somehow Wilt was supposed to defeat Bill Russell every single time. So they talked about that. They talked about some of the heartbreaking losses that he suffered to Wilt Chamberlain, because with Wilt it was never the team, it was always him. Game 7 of, what was it, the 1965, what series was that, when Havlicek stole the ball? Was that the NBA Finals? I can't remember whether that was the NBA Finals or whether that was the conference final. I think it was the conference final because I think Wilt was back in Philly by that time. But anyway, when Havlicek stole the ball, they talked about that, one of the worst losses, one of the low points in Wilt's career. Even though Wilt was not involved in that particular play, even though Wilt's last 4 points actually pulled the team within 1, they talked about how they get lost in the narrative. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the narrative was starting to grow larger and larger that Wilt could not win. They talk about, of course, that 2-year period when the 76ers posed a major threat to the Boston Celtics in 1967, with Wilt shooting the ball less and less. One of the all-time great teams in 1967, 76ers won 68 games, 68-13. That was when the season was 81 games. They dispatched the Boston Celtics in the conference finals and beat Rick Barry, high-scoring Rick Barry, who averaged 35.6 points per game during the regular season. Dispatched of Rick Barry and the San Francisco Warriors in the finals, 4-2. I believe in that series, Rick Barry averaged 40.8 points per game, which was the record for a finals until Michael Jordan did it in 1993. As a matter of fact, Michael Jordan was a lot more efficient than Rick Barry was. I think Rick shot like 40% from the floor in 1967. Michael Jordan shot about 51% from the floor, I think, in that series, 51%. But anyway, they talked about how Wilt just couldn't sustain it. The very next year, the defending champion Sixers would lose to the Boston Celtics in the conference finals. Now, to be fair, if my memory serves me correctly, I don't know if they mentioned this or not. The Sixers suffered some injuries. If I remember, I think Chet Walker got hurt before that series, and I think another key player was hurt. It might have been Billy Cunningham, but I don't think they mentioned that in the series. But it didn't matter because the narrative is that Wilt Chamberlain could not beat Bill Russell consistently, and we still see that narrative surviving to this very day. What else are they talking about? They talked about Wilt Chamberlain's womanizing. Now, this is where I had a problem with. I had a problem with Carrie Champion on there, who's clearly, we know what Carrie Champion is about, right? She kept referring to Wilt as a womanizer. I have a problem with that term, okay? I have a problem with that term because to me, when people use that term womanizer, in their mind, they're describing a man who is deceitful with women, who is deceitful in his intent with relationships, that he is a man who will give a woman the impression that they're in a monogamous relationship when in fact he has multiple partners. Well, that's not Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain let it be known that he was a swinger, that he was a single man. He liked women. And I don't think he ever gave a woman the impression that she was the only one. All right? That's not a womanizer. That's a single man enjoying a single life. So you're trying to tell me either you have to be celibate or married and monogamous if you're a man, but when a woman does the exact same thing, she's sexually liberated? As a matter of fact, I would think women fit the bill more these days. I know of many women, almost every woman I've met, I would say 98% of women I've met in my life fit the bill. They might be in a relationship, but they're actually cheating on their spouse. Sometimes I think both spouse knows what's going on, that they're not, they both know that the other one is cheating. But I know many women who are in relationships or have been married, and they cheat on their spouse, and the spouse doesn't even know about it. So at the end of the day, I think women kind of fit that bill just as well in today's world. But you don't call them, what is the equivalent of a womanizer? Whatever the equivalency is when it comes to a woman, I know a lot of women who trick men into thinking they're in a monogamous relationship and they're cheating. But that's taboo to quote unquote slut shame them. So I had a problem with that. Okay, that was a different time period. And to me, even if a man still wants to engage in that, as long as he's honest and not hurting people's feelings, who gives a fuck? So I really didn't like Carrie Champion's stupid ass fucking input on that. But they talked about that part of Wilt Chamberlain's life. And they talked about his political views toward the end. Not a lot, but they talked about how Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell were pretty much the first power players in the NBA. The first two players to really have that type of juice. The first two players to really have the power to influence the NBA. They talked about how Wilt Chamberlain's presence on the Warriors increased the value of the Warriors some 3,000% from the time that he was acquired. I think they said that the person who owned the Warriors, I forgot his name, was it Eddie Gottlieb? It might have been Eddie Gottlieb, I can't remember now. But anyway, when he purchased the Warriors, I think he said that when he purchased them, he purchased them for like $45,000. But when he sold the team, he sold them for a then record $850,000. A lot of that had to do with the growth and value of the team because of Wilt Chamberlain. When Wilt Chamberlain joined the NBA, a $30,000 per year salary was big money. By 1963, that was obsolete. A big contract was $95,000 to $100,000. And by the time Wilt Chamberlain retired in 1973, NBA players were making $350,000, $400,000 a year. That is a monstrous increase in salary. That is what is that? A tenfold increase in salary on average. And we have Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson and Jerry West to thank for that. All right? So, economic empowerment was one aspect of Wilt Chamberlain's philosophy. He felt that the next step after, and Martin Luther King Jr. believed this as well. He felt that the next step for African Americans, what we want to call us, after the attainment of basic civil rights, was economic empowerment. And that was the link to which Wilt Chamberlain had toward Richard Nixon. Wilt Chamberlain was a Republican, which sounds like anathema today, obviously a black man being Republican. But you gotta understand, when Wilt Chamberlain was born in 1936, many black people in this country were voting Republican, especially in the North. Black people have been voting Republican since the 1860s, those who could vote, because that was the party of Lincoln. Of course, Lincoln is perceived as the president who, quote unquote, freed the slaves. So for many decades, blacks voted, especially in the North, when black people could vote, majority Republican. Although that started to break down even by as early as the early 19-teens, 1920s, but definitely by the 1930s, black Americans were starting to vote more Democratic. But there still was a great deal of black people who ancestrally were voting Republican all the way through the 1950s and 1960s. And Wilt Chamberlain was one of these. And, we got to understand, too, the Republican Party, until the late 60s and early 1970s, was still dominated by the moderate wing of the Republican Party. But there was changes going on, manifesting itself in the late 1960s, when Richard Nixon became the standard bearer for the Republican Party, and they adopted a Southern strategy, which meant that, even though they never would admit it, obviously, the Republican Party started courting disaffected white Southerners who had traditionally been voting Democratic. Now, on many state and local elections, these individuals would still vote Democratic all the way through the 1990s. But nationally, the Democratic nominee at that time was Hubert Humphrey. And there was this perception that the national Democratic leaders were too liberal, too pro-black for them to support. And the Nixon Republicans picked up on this, so they tried to court many of these disaffected white Southerners with law and order and coded language, So they touched on that. And another thing they talked about was Wilt Chamberlain's friendship with Ike Richmond. Ike Richmond was the owner of the 76ers. I think Ike Richmond was very, very close with Wilt Chamberlain, and Ike Richmond tried to do Wilt right. I think they said something in the documentary about when Wilt was traded back to the Sixers, or traded back to Philly, I should say, excuse me, because Wilt had played for the Philadelphia Warriors, but then the Warriors, after 1962-63, moved to San Francisco, became the San Francisco Warriors, but then I think in 65 it was, might have been 64 or 65. Sometime in that time period, Wilt was traded back to Philly, to the Philadelphia 76ers, who had been it can get confusing. The Sixers had been the Syracuse Nationals. So how it worked is, until 1963, the Syracuse Nationals were in Syracuse, New York. The Philadelphia Warriors were in Philly. But after 63, the Philadelphia Warriors moved to San Francisco, and simultaneously, the Syracuse Nationals moved to Philly and became the Philadelphia 76ers, as we know them today. Now, of course, the Warriors are now the Golden State Warriors, but that's how that happened. But anyway, Ike Richman, when he brought Wilt Chamberlain back to Philly, I think he had a chorus of children chant Wilt Chamberlain's name, and Wilt was a big lover of kids, and this was one of the most touching things that anyone ever did for Wilt from a professional standpoint, and he and Ike Richman were very close. But unfortunately, December 3rd, 1965, Ike Richman dropped dead of a heart attack. The Philadelphia 76ers owner, he dropped dead of a heart attack at a basketball game. And this affected Wilt Chamberlain greatly. They also talked about something I did not know. I knew that prior to joining the NBA in 1959, Wilt Chamberlain played for the Harlem Globetrotters. But I did not know that for the next 17 years, Wilt Chamberlain would periodically play for the Harlem Globetrotters and tour throughout Europe. Now that's something I did not know. So you learn something every day, you know what I mean? And that's where Wilt honed a lot of his passing ability. That's where Wilt, honed a lot of other skill sets that he didn't have prior to joining the NBA in 1959. That's another what if as well. What if Wilt Chamberlain, because at that time there was a rule that there had to be a 4-year period between when you joined college and when you were drafted to the NBA. So Wilt had to wait another year, which was 1959, to play in the NBA. But what if Wilt had been able to join the NBA in 1958 and he had a whole nother season? What would his final numbers have looked like? That'd have probably been another 2,500, 2,700 points added to his career total. He would probably still be the all-time leader in scoring average. He probably would have had well over 25,000 rebounds. But anyway, all in all, for the most part, I found it pretty enjoyable. I like the fact that they mentioned that Wilt was something of a woman's liber, even though he has his reputation for being a womanizer. But I all in all, I found it pretty enjoyable. The episode, I found it pretty enjoyable. A lot of the stuff, like I said, I already knew, but I'm glad they touched on it. I'm glad they touched on the fact that a lot of the things that players like LeBron James get credited for, Wilt was doing back then. Signing these 1-year contracts, or trying to influence the organization to give these 1-year contracts. See, players didn't really have the freedoms that they have today, but you started seeing player empowerment begin with that generation of players. Salary demands. You started seeing a shortening of contracts. Before in the 40s and 50s, man, sometimes these teams could own you for 6-7 years and pigeonhole you into these long contracts, and these guys weren't really making a lot of money in the 40s and 50s. As you've heard, as late as the early 1960s, players like Paul Arizin had to work jobs in the off season just to make ends meet. So players like Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, through ratings and through improvements in revenue, players were now able to make a lot more money, to the point where, with the exception of maybe some bench warmers, you didn't have to work in the off season to make ends meet. So I think these players deserve a lot more respect, especially Oscar Robertson, because I've said this before. Oscar Robertson was the one who took the NBA all the way to the Supreme Court in 1970 to seriously open up free agency. So, commend to Oscar Robertson, commend to Curt Flood in Major League Baseball. Even though Curt Flood is not a Hall of Famer, he should be a name recognized and appreciated, because he's pretty much sacrificed his career, because he was blackballed from Major League Baseball for what he did. But he helped to create player freedom as far as choosing their own destinies. But anyway, I look forward to the third part of this documentary. Tell me what you guys think.